This is a presentation to PHAROS, the Canadian Hellenic Culture Society of Vancouver, and the presentation was given on February 24, 2020 at the Hellenic Community of Vancouver Centre. The topic was Greeks in Vancouver, Stories and Photographs, and it was based on the Hellenic Stories project, a project of the Vancouver Public Library in partnership with the Hellenic Community of Vancouver. Back in 2017, a group of librarians from digital services, including myself, came to the Hellenic Community Center and invited people from the community to come and contribute their stories and photographs for the project Hellenic Stories of Vancouver. For 3 evenings, many people, close to 40, came and were interviewed. They shared their photographs and stories. And the project now lives in the server of the Vancouver Public Library. This is the link, This Vancouver Hellenic Stories. Once you click the link, you will land on this page. It gives you a bit of information. You can search it. You see the search box, top right. And this is just the first page of many more with audio clips from the interviews given back in 2017 by members of the community, and also a lot of photographs. My presentation could not have included all the stories or all the photographs, so I encourage everyone to go to This Vancouver Hellenic Stories at the Vancouver Public Library and listen to more stories and see many more photographs. But to begin the presentation, we go back to the 16th century in 1592 with the first Greek man, first Greek person who arrived in this part of the world. His name was Ioannis Fokas, known to the Spaniards as Juan de Fuca. He was the first European to arrive at the northwest coast of Canada. He was a maritime pilot serving Philip II, King of Spain, and he was the one who discovered the strait which is between Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula, and which is now known as the Juan de Fuca Strait. There is a lot of research, a lot of books written about Juan de Fuca, Ioannis Foka. We're very proud of him, and I encourage you all to read these books. Ioannis Fokas went back to his native island of Cephalonia and passed away in 1602. The first Greek immigrants to arrive in North America did not come until the 19th century, after 1827, after the War of Independence. They were mostly fortune seekers, young men who were after gold. The first Greek pioneer to arrive in British Columbia is this man, George Nicholas Kapiotis. He arrived in Fort Victoria from Evia in 1851. He was a seafarer who had fought in the Crimean War and took part in the Mexican Revolution. He came to North America during the California Gold Rush, took part in the Fraser and Caribou Gold Rush, and finally settled in Victoria and married Marie Anne, the daughter of one indigenous chief. His descendants included famous athletes, the Athens family, a granddaughter who married the grandson of Sir James Douglas, and many more important members of the Greek community in Victoria and the Lower Mainland, as well as the larger Canadian society. The second Greek to arrive in BC is this man called John Yannaris, also known later as Stevens. He changed his name, as was common to many Greek and other immigrants in those days. There was prejudice, and many people anglicized their names. He arrived in Vancouver, in Gastown, in 1878 after deserting ship. He spent one winter cutting wood. He worked for the Canadian Pacific Railroad, and he was the first Greek to fish for salmon in the Fraser River. In 1885, he and another Greek, George Kontrafila, entered the fishing business in Ladner. By 1895, he and 11 other Greeks had built their own cannery. Mostly were bachelors from islands, mostly from the island of Skopelos. John Yannaris also married an indigenous woman. And that's how, with those Greeks and John Yannaris and George Kontrafila, the Greek fishing community on this island was established around 1895. As it is often common with immigrants, they bring their brothers, their wives or betrothed and children, and they bring them to the place where they settle. And that's what happened here. Many people came to this island. At its peak, the community had approximately 80 residents and 30 float houses like the one you see here. They salvaged logs and building materials from the river and constructed a float home settlement on the main channel. The men were fishing and hunting. The women and children planted vegetable gardens, raised chickens and goats, and the young children had to row across this channel to the mainland and walk through farm fields to Trenant School on Crescent Island. One of the pioneer women there is Urania Kappaduka, Peter Kappaduka's grandmother, that you see her here in one of the float homes of the early settlers in Ladner. Another fish family was the Nicholas Tsoukalas family. Nicholas Tsoukalas immigrated to Canada with his parents in 1913. According to his family, and more specifically to Connie Tsoukalas, his granddaughter, they settled at this island in a float home where a large Greek fishing community was well established. In 1929, he had the fishing boat built, the one that you see here, and he named it the Naftilos, Nautilus. He bought his own float home for his family, which was moved to Tilbury Island and eventually moored in Ladner Harbor. Nick Tsoukalas fished the Fraser River until he died in 1972. However, the Greek immigration to Canada was slow throughout the 19th century. Canada's preference for immigrants from Northern and Western Europe impeded large-scale immigration from Greece. However, immigrants were still coming. This is a photograph from the National Archives of Canada. This is from back east. Some Greek immigrants, including two priests that you see in the middle there. There was poverty and political instability in Greece, and people were trying to escape all that. They were mostly, though, arriving in the East or in the United States, not so much in Western Canada. In 1911, in Vancouver, there were only very few Greek families and around 300 bachelors. Many men. They worked on railroads, the sawmills, log camps. This is some of them. This is a photograph that belonged to the Konstantinos Megalos estate, and we think he's the one to the right, far right. So as you see, they're roasting a lamb. It's probably Greek Easter. They're celebrating Greek Easter. There were people, though, that opened businesses in downtown Vancouver at the turn of the century. A lot of them had fruit stands, shoe shine parlors like the late Michael Chikitis, who arrived here in 1916, ice cream parlors, and many cafes and restaurants. Here is one of them in 1908, the Marathon Cafe on Granville Street. It belonged to the Asimakopoulos brothers and Alexander Tsakoumis. Alexander Tsakoumis' family is still very involved in the Greek community, a big family with many descendants. Another pioneer who arrived in Vancouver in 1913 is this man called Leo Raptis. The photograph was contributed to the Hellenic Stories by his granddaughter. He apparently started at Fraser Mills, but later on he opened a grocery store in Vancouver. He had a grocery on Kingsway and Perry Street, 4195 Perry Street, and this photograph shows him standing there in front of his store, and apparently his house was on the top. He was a major contributor to the first Greek church. According to the family lore, he might have been involved in bootlegging, but he was never caught. The photograph to the right from the city archives shows Kingsway a little bit further north, just to show you how the street was in those days. Actually, in 1913, the street was called Kingsway. Before that, it was called Vancouver Road. Another pioneer family was the Almas family. The first person who arrived in Vancouver around 1908 was George Almayas, also known as George Almas. He left his village of Galimi in Marmara, modern-day Turkey, around 1905 or 1906, perhaps as a seaman. He went to New York, then to San Francisco, Seattle, and by 1910 he was in business of some type at Robson and Richards. His granddaughter, Elaine Spilos, has written a very nice article about George Almas and his family. In 1911, his brother Tom arrived in Vancouver. Then another brother, Diamond, arrived in 1912. From 1913 to 1920, all brothers ran the Almas Coal Company, which had a small fleet of 2 trucks, similar to the one that you see in the picture, although that's not the one that belonged to the Almas Coal Company. And also they had 2 horse and buggies for deliveries. Apparently, according to his granddaughter, George was the first Greek in Vancouver to drive and one of the first Vancouverites to have a telephone. Vancouverites may remember the Almas food store on East Broadway, the King Neptune seafood restaurant in New Westminster that you see to the right, and also the beloved Seven Seas restaurant in North Vancouver. A famous pioneer was the man that you see to the left with his American wife. His name was Alexander Pandagis. You can write, as I mentioned, a couple of novels about his life. He left home. He left his island of Andros at the age of 9. He worked many jobs in several countries. He went to the Klondike and he ended settling in Seattle, where he started to build his vaudeville empire. At its peak, his empire had close to 84 theaters in North America, US and Canada. Alexander Pantages is very important in the show business history of Vancouver because he built 2 theaters, the Pantages that you see here and the Majestic in 1917. Unfortunately, neither of them survives today. Alexander Pantages invited a lot of his family to come and help him run his business, his vaudeville theater business. One of them was his brother George, and another one was his nephew, this handsome young man that you see here playing in the snow in 1927. His name was Peter Pantages. Peter Pantages came to help his uncle run the Pantages Theatre, and he loved to swim. Apparently, he liked to swim sometimes even 3 times a day. And one day, on January 1st, 1920, according to Eve Lazarus, local historian, he persuaded 5 friends to jump into the cold waters of the Pacific. And that's how the Vancouver Polar Bear Swim started. He's the founder of the Vancouver Polar Bear Swim, which celebrated its 100 years this year. It's one of the oldest polar bear swims in the world, and it's very popular, attended by tens of thousands of people. Peter Pantages became a very successful businessman on his own right. Later on, he opened the Peter Pan Cafe on Granville Street, 1180 Granville Street. You see the Peter Pan Cafe later in 1934 in this picture from the archives. And also he opened on 1636 West Broadway the Peter Pan Hall. Many Greeks used the Peter Pan Hall and the Peter Pan Cafe for celebrations, for banquets after baptisms or weddings, and also for celebrations like this one, which is probably from the National Day celebration, March 25th, 1928. There were more Greeks in the 20s, around 40 families. They did not have a church. They were renting mainly St. James Anglican Church. They did not have a permanent hall to hold their celebrations or to have a Greek and Sunday school for their children. As you see, they were renting other places they didn't have a gathering place. So in November 1927, the Hellenic community of BC was incorporated as a society under the Societies Act. Its name was the St. George Greek Orthodox Hellenic Community. Of course, they needed money. They started to fundraise to build a church and a small community hall next to it. The Women's Auxiliary of the Hellenic Community of Vancouver was formed in 1929. The founder was this lovely woman, Athena Athans, who was the granddaughter of George Nicholas Kapiotis, the first immigrant that we saw, who arrived in BC in Fort Victoria. So the women were doing a lot of fundraising. Also, the AHEPA, the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association from the States, was helping very much to fundraise. And finally, 3 years later, after the incorporation of the Hellenic community, a Greek Orthodox church, St. George's Church, was built on 7th and Vine Street. On Palm Sunday of 1930, every Greek for hundreds of miles around came to celebrate Mass in their own home, as their Greek Orthodox Church was called. This is a heritage building, and today is part of Kids House, and you see the Kids House and the original building restored to the right. The new church attracted Greeks who started to move closer to it. But there were not many new immigrants. There was Great Depression. One person who lost a lot those days was Ted Pappas Sr., that you see him standing to the left. And he was one of the first immigrants to arrive first to New York, then San Francisco, and then up to Prince George, where he started his business in 1913. He was only 17 when he arrived in Prince George, and he didn't have a lot of education. He would buy furs from First Nations trappers, then hop on a train to New York, where he'd sell the wild mink, the lynx cat, beaver, and other pelts at auction. He did very well, and for a while he owned a good chunk of downtown Prince George. But his wife died in 1928, and then he lost everything in the 1929 stock market crash. So he came down to Vancouver as a penniless single father. His son is on the cart there. You see him, Ted Pappas Jr. However, due to his determination and hard work and entrepreneurial spirit, he managed, like many Greeks, to rebuild his business. He bought Pappas' first building on Hamilton Street, and by the 1950s, Pappas' Furs was a booming business, financing trappers for 3 or 4 months between taking the pelts and selling them at auction. Another man that did not give up during Depression was Nick Kogos, who was famous in the Greek community, a benefactor of the Greek community, who in 1931, after owning several cafes and restaurants, he took over the Commodore Ballroom, and he managed to make it boom, and they were offering $1 evenings, Saturday evenings, to people who did not have a lot of money to spend in those hard days. Nick Kogos loved Greece, was very proud of his heritage, and later on, when he had a big estate and a villa in West Vancouver, he built a small-scale Parthenon, which was a joy to everyone in the area to see as they were sailing by, or to visit during the weekend and have picnics there. So here you see to the right the replica, the small-scale replica of the Parthenon, and Nick Kogos and friends together with his wife. Unfortunately, that building, the Parthenon, is not there anymore. It has been demolished after Nick Kogos passing away. The whole estate was sold to developers, and I guess it was probably hard to maintain. So despite the Depression years, the community was together around the church. The kids were going to school. Here is the Greek school Socrates in 1938. The Philoptochos Society, the women of the Philoptochos were fundraising. This is a lovely picture which is part of our historical photographs collection at VPL, with the ladies of the Philoptochos at a fundraising garden party in 1939. And then the Second World War broke out. Emigration stopped during the Second World War. There was a lot of concern about Greece, about the homeland. People were fundraising. The women joined the Red Cross. Here you see two young girls selling raffles for the Greek war relief. The next photograph from the city archives shows the Greek float during the Victory Loan Parade on Barrard Street in 1942. And this is March 25th, our National Day celebration in 1943 at the Old St. George's Church. I'm sure a lot of thoughts and prayers for the Greeks who were under German occupation at the time and going through hard times. Some of the young men joined the military, joined the army during the war. The older men, of course, and their families were contributing clothing and food and money to send back to Greece. After the Second World War, though, Canada became more open to immigrants from Southern Europe, and through family sponsorship and other employment schemes, Greeks had easier entrance into Canada. After the end of the war, immigration sharply picked up, and over 100,000 Greeks entered Canada between 1945 and 1971. People started arriving mainly through transatlantic liners. Here is in 1954 a group of them on board the ship Nea Elas. You can see André and his brother, André Demiris and his brother Gas Demiris. Another photograph from 1954, same ship, Nea Hellas, and you can see Leo Balatsas and his friend John Vervilis and possibly other people from Vancouver arriving to Halifax. There were also families reunited at that point. The men had come earlier on, and now they were inviting their families to come and join them. Here is the family of Ellie Ferguson and her 3 children on board the ship Italia in 1960, coming to Vancouver to be reunited with her husband Tommy, who was here before. One of the people who arrived in 1948 in Vancouver was Dr. Stelios Angelomatis. The reason he is singled out here is because he was a very educated man. He had a very interesting life, according to his daughter Wanda Angelomatis. Dr. Stelios Angelomatis was born in modern-day Turkey in Smyrna, and then he came to Greece with part of his family as a refugee. He studied in Austria and Germany. And then during the Second World War, he served as the army, as a doctor. He also fought as a soldier and eventually met his Canadian wife, who was serving as a nurse in Thessaloniki. They got married, and then he immigrated with the wife to Canada. He arrived in Vancouver in 1948, and he had a medical practice in Vancouver from the early 1950s to the late 1980s. And he was the doctor of most Greeks in Vancouver. According again to his daughter, he probably delivered the majority of Greek children born in the 1950s and 1960s. However, many other people immigrated in response to the demands for unskilled labor. Many worked in construction, many on the Kitimat project. The BC and Canadian governments and the Aluminum Company of Canada promoted Kitimat around the world. The Kitimat project was the largest construction project for the time, and thousands came and participated in the construction activity. Here you see to the left George Kaunas, to the right Nick Zambus in Kitimat in 1956, when Alcan Aluminum Company of Canada was built. Kostas Kaunas, who contributed this photograph to the project, said that they slept on the Delta King River boat before Kitimat, and they were among the first Greeks, among the first workers for Alcan. So with people arriving, the group of Greeks in Vancouver quadrupled. There was so much energy, so many young people. Here you see in the 1950s the church youth choir. In 1958, a production of the play Golfo. There were many drama productions, many cultural events. Young people fell in love. These are two people, Christos and Mando Christodoulou, on their wedding day at the old St. George's in 1959. They have a very sweet love story, which was shared by their daughter, Evelyn Economos. She said that her dad, Christos, figured out a way to meet beautiful Mando. He started ripping off his buttons, tearing his zippers, and going to the dry cleaners where Mando worked as a seamstress, so he would see her. They were not allowed to date, and he phoned her uncle and asked for his permission to walk her home, from work to the house. And thankfully, their love story had a very happy end, as you see there. Here's another story, a bit later in 1968. Another beautiful woman, another seamstress, Anna Ziakos, and her holding the hand of her husband, Dimitrios, Jim Ziakos. What's unusual in their story was that Anna was here first, and then went back to Greece and brought to Canada her husband. It was normally the other way around. It was mostly the men who were bringing their fiancés and sometimes mail order brides here. So that was different. The community was getting really crowded. By the late 1950s, there were 500 families. The space was not enough. Here you see New Year's Eve 1963. You can see how crowded it is. Although another reason I selected this picture is for the couple. This is George and Dionysia Giannakopoulos dancing. And George is the oldest man of the Greek community at this point. He turned recently 100 years old, and we wish him many happy returns. And they both contributed in so many different ways to the Hellenic community of Vancouver. But as I said, another reason of showing this picture is to show you how the community hall was getting really tight. Another picture that shows that is this Greek school concert picture with the teacher Eleftheria Trifonas, and you see how jam-packed it is with kids and how small the stage was. So the community decided to purchase the property where the Hellenic Community Center and Church of St. George is standing at a general meeting on April 22nd, 1962. And by June 1964, the lot was bought for $72,720. Yes, it was rather, it was not that expensive in those days. Building the community center and St. George's was truly a labor of love and a triumph of the power of volunteerism and passion. I love this picture from 1970. You see from the left the then President Kostas Liaskas, Father Kamilakis, and the Treasurer Michael Chikitis. The one that I mentioned had started as a poor shoe shine boy back in 1916. So what I love about this picture is that you can feel the passion, the enthusiasm, the positive energy, the pride. Mrs. Rula Liaskas says how her husband, the late Kostas Liaskas, had a business downtown in which many Greeks worked. He brought all the people working for him to clean the area before the church was ready. He spent money from his business to pay them to do that work. He also helped in many other things and contributed so much to the Hellenic community of Vancouver, and he was not, of course, the only one. The new church was completed by Easter 1971 with a seating capacity in excess of 500. The formal consecration was in October of 1977 with a new priest who arrived in 1974. You see him here in a picture of 1975, Father Dimitrios Partsafas with his wife Irini and 3 of their children. There would be a 4th one in the few years after this picture. And Father Dimitrios served the church and the community for 40 years, and he is beloved by all. This is a commemorative postcard with the new St. George's and the Hellenic Community Center. The ribbon cutting for the opening of the Hellenic Community of Vancouver was in January 12, 1977. You can see from the left Antonia Bonis, Bill Tsakoumis, Emmanuel Manolis Papoutsakis, Father Dimitrios Partsafas, Angelo Papas, president at the time, Nicholas Kogos, the Metropolitan Sotirios, and Mr. George Bonis. Mr. Papas, in his interview, he said that when we opened this community center, we wanted to make sure this was a center to be used by the neighbors, by the wider community. We got funding from the federal government, which was available to any project that was open to all. And that's the way it has been, used by seniors, meetings, political party gatherings, etc. When people come here, they should always feel at home. Of course, there was a celebration. You can see a lovely photograph from the opening celebrations of the Hellenic Community Center. You can see the crowds, the flags, the dignitaries, the Metropolitan and the altar boys. You can feel the enthusiasm and the happiness, the joy of that day. Of course, there was a lot of food, as with all celebrations. Here you see in the center 3 of the people who cooked as volunteers. It's from the left, Stamatis Kouromichelakis, Chef Tony Andonis Nikolidakis, and George Vendouris. Helen Nikolidakis Salisbury talked about her father, the late Tony Nikolidakis. She said, "My father became the executive chef at Sheraton Landmark Hotel on Robson Street and supported the building of the community center by cooking for fundraisers, a lot of them at the Sheraton Hotel. And later on, when the community center was built, he cooked for so many events, never took any money, not even a cup of coffee. He was proud of his Greek heritage." And of course, to this day, we have so many people volunteering their skills and time to cook and to contribute to activities at the Hellenic Community Center. The new center, there was a first Greek food festival in 1977. Nick Vasilakakis contributed this photograph, and he said, "I remember drawing numerous pictures depicting life in Greece. They were posted on the walls of the community center. One of them is on the wall shown in the photo. You see the one saying Yasu. I remember organizing the entertainment and much more. I, my sister Athena, and Nikki Balatsas of the group Enosis are in the middle of the photo looking on. Peter Kapaduka is on the mic, and George, the manager of the community center, stands below. And the man clapping, dressed as god Dionysus, is Vangelis Atevatis, and you can see him here as I said, Dionysus, the god of wine, surrounded by women of the Philoptochos and other volunteers on that day, the first Greek food festival day. A few years ago, of course, we had the first Greek day on June 30th, 1974. The people in the picture are members of the Cretan Association, the first of many regional associations formed in Vancouver. There were a lot of Cretans. The Cretan Association was founded in 1967. So from the left is Zacharias Petousis, Efi Karapidakis, who gave this picture, Olga Mavridakis, and Manolis Papoutsakis. Efi Karapidakis, in her interview, said how she and two other women, her kumbares, sat down and stayed up late the evening before Greek Day to make the costumes they are wearing in this picture. And Greek Day was a big event for the community. In those days there were parades like the Greek school parade that we see right here, and we see Helen Sipsas and Joanna Virvilis. Other people talked about their experience on Greek Day. One of them was Georgia Chonis. She said, "I would parade in my costume. My mother had actually made this costume. I would wear it to other Greek school events. But there was so much excitement on Greek Day. First the parade, then we would dance, then we would help out with respect to the Greek food, and then we would roam in the streets with our Greek friends." So it was really an exciting, proud day, as still is for the Greeks of Vancouver. So in the 1970s, not only many Greeks had moved to the Kitsilano area, but also people started moving to Vancouver, having made money in Kitimat and up north, or moving from eastern Canada to join relatives, or attracted to the nice climate of British Columbia. So several Greek entrepreneurs started businesses along West Broadway and later on West 4th. A Greek commercial village was established west of McDonald Street, and it was called Greek Town. Here's a map of Greek Town from the book Ethnic Vancouver. When I posted this picture on Facebook, people told me these were not all the Greek businesses at the time. So you can imagine, I believe every other store was a Greek business. So we will mention now some, not all, of the Greek businesses and of the different jobs that Greeks were doing in those days, and share some of their stories. There were many bakeries. Here is Pascal Melanidis working at Gisella's Pastry in 1974. Soon after, as his son Chris Melanidis said, he opened up Astoria Bakery on Thurlow and Robson Street, and much later he had Paschalis Bakery, Pascal's, near the university gates, the University of British Columbia gates. Another bakery was the Louis Bakery. He was owned by Louis Zerbinos, and he operated it with his wife and two daughters, Anna and Vicky. Anna came and gave an interview for the Hellenic Stories of Vancouver project, and I will share some of her story here. She said that they were the only one in Vancouver that made homemade phyllo. You can see here the Louis Zerbinos making phyllo. It's pictures from a book. So Anna says, we were making 100 pounds every day, 5 days a week. On Saturdays we were selling lineups, very hard work. My dad would wake up at 4:30 in the morning and will not leave until they close the shop. Too exhausted after that. But it was a family business, no employees. Mother, father, and daughters, we all helped with the filo. You need a lot of people. The table was a 10 by 10 foot table. You had to dry the sheets before you would do the dough. Each layer had to be covered by the hot sheets. So my sister and I would throw the sheet right away to cover it so it wouldn't get dry. This was going on and on. Of course, they had small businesses. Here is Andre Demiris, the man that we saw arriving in 1954 to Canada with his brother. And this is with a friend, Mr. Giftonikolios, in 1970. The photograph was contributed by his daughter, Susie, and she said that this was their shop, their deli, University Delicatessen on West Broadway, 2884, which later became Vasilis Taverna. And of course here too, as is the story of all Greek immigrants and other immigrants, the whole family was working for Vasilis Taverna and for their businesses. Another business was Minerva Imports. You see to the left their first location and then their later location on Broadway. It was owned by Mike and Georgia Georgopoulos, and Mike Georgopoulos also had a radio station with a very popular radio program. And this, as you see, was a very popular place for Greek people, especially seniors, to visit and have a cup of coffee and a chat until it closed just a few years ago. One of the surviving Greektown businesses is Parthenon Market, which was established in 1967. It changed ownership several times. Right now it belongs to the Morphidis family. It changed location several times, but it is one of the popular supermarkets and delis, and it's very popular with the Canadians, not just the Greeks. There were, of course, body shops and gas stations. This is Texaco gas station, which was owned by Leo and Chris Balachas. You see Leo Balachas in his office to the right here. It was at the corner of East Broadway at Carolina from 1961 to 1984. The daughter of Leo Balachas, Nikki Balachas Roussanidis, gave an interview and said, "As a youngster, I had to go to the Texaco on Broadway to visit my father, who was working from sun up to sundown." Very hard working, all of them. Sometimes we wouldn't have seen him for days, and my mother would drive us to the gas station so we could see him. At around 12, it didn't matter I was a girl. I had to work at the gas station, pumping gas. All my friends worked in their parents' business. Just a service station, but a large number of Greek people would gather there to talk politics every day. Mostly men. They would sit there for hours, almost a coffee shop. Of course, there were many restaurants. Here are some cards: Stavros, Maria's Taverna, Zorbas, Shish Kebab, Onassis, Vasilis Taverna, Estia, and many more. Olympia Pizza is another surviving business since 1967, and it belongs to the Karasiotis family. The Karasiotis family is another story of what we call chain immigration. One person of the family comes and then brings along all his relatives, or almost all his relatives. So in 1959, the first Karasiotis' brother, John Karasiotis, arrived in Ontario. He wasn't too fond of the winter, and within a year he migrated to BC. He worked in pulp mills up the coast and slowly brought his brothers over from Greece. Peter came in 1962, George in 1966, Jim in 1968, and Nick and Tim in 1974. In 1967, the family opened a restaurant in Kitsilano with their friend George Skouras. Not really a Greek restaurant, a pizza joint, Olympia Pizza. And to the right you see young Tim Karasiotis at Olympia Pizza. When we started, there was only John's Pizzarama across the street, but then everybody followed. Every Greek was opening a pizza and pasta place. Another Greek restaurant was Romeos Taverna, which was on West 4th Avenue. The owner that you see to the left was Andreas Arvanitis. He said, it was not easy to own business. You have to work hard day and night. 40 years in the restaurant business. Romeos Taverna on 4th. The kids started working there when they were 10 to 12 years old until they went to university. Hard work for everyone, especially in the restaurant business. This is Kosmas restaurant, a bit away from Greek town. This was located at 801 Pacific Street from 1974 to 1982. You see how beautiful it was. It had a beautiful courtyard, a long bar, a fireplace, whitewashed walls, and lots of terracotta tile. It belonged to Costa and Larry Siskakis, Sophie and Christos Dikiakos. The artist, Christos Dikiakos, assisted with the decor and interior design. The restaurant was a game changer in Vancouver, setting a standard for Mediterranean fine dining that would be emulated by many. At the time, Christos Dikiakos remembers, Greek restaurants were the most exotic form of dining experience in frontier fine dining of Vancouver. Of course, people wanted to travel back home, especially once they made some money. And there were a lot of travel agencies. One that survives to this day and is thriving is Omega Travel. Nick Panos, the owner to the right with his wife Maria Panos, arrived in Vancouver in 1961. And Nick opened Omega Travel in 1974 on West Broadway. Omega Travel moved location 3 times, but it's still on Broadway. And Nick Panos, of course, is very well known for his support of a lot of cultural events and Greek Day and the Hellenic Chair at SFU, but we will say more about all that further down. Of course, there were barbers and barber shops. People may remember Yanni Yakumelos to the left at John's and Peter's Barber Shop on Broadway. And of course, to the right is Dino Arvanitis, who purchased Economy Barber Shop in Kerrisdale in 1979, back when the price for a haircut was an affordable $3.50. And there was a very interesting article in the Vancouver Sun about Dino Arvanitis very recently. Another man that had hair salons was Mr. George Chronopoulos. Here he is seen at his Royal Riviera Salon in 1973. He said in his interview he was the first barber to offer men's hairstyles in the 60s. He opened 2 salons, one on Seymour Street called the Riviera and another on the lower level of the Hyatt Hotel. Over the years, Mr. Chronopoulos cut the hair of Vancouver's business elite, including Jimmy Pattison, Joe Segal, Sid Belzberg, Bob Golden, Sid Golden, and many more. The story of Mr. Chronopoulos has been published in a book, My Greek Barber's Diary, which I recommend to anyone who wants to read more about Mr. Chronopoulos. And also, Mr. Chronopoulos is the person who started the Gold Plate annual fundraising event, and he's very, very proud of that. So, the Greeks were on the west side of Vancouver, but there was a strong presence of Greeks in East Vancouver. So in 1978, the East Vancouver parish and community were incorporated. In 1979, the Greek Orthodox community of East Vancouver rented the upper hall of Holy Resurrection Russian Orthodox Church for liturgical purposes. The contract was renewed until October 1985, when the Greek community moved into the new Saints Nicholas and Demetrios Church on Boundary Road. So you see some pictures from the construction to the finished St. Nicholas and Demetrios Church on Boundary Road, and the priest, Father Dorotheos Trifonopoulos. The 80s, of course, had Greek days until 1988. I include this picture here of the Philhellenic dancers because the president of the PHAROS Society, Rick Spradley, is proudly dancing. He's the first man on the left, and for many, many years, Rick, who is a great Philhellene, I thought he was Greek. He speaks Greek, he loves Greece, he dances Greek dances. He is really Greek, I think. Anyway, so the Greek days were very popular, but the reveling was becoming a little bit wild. And in 1988, unfortunately, they had to cancel the Greek Day, which was thankfully resurrected in 2005, as we will see further down. One of the unforgettable events of the 1980s was the fact that the float of the Hellenic community of Vancouver won the first prize at the Sea Festival on Vancouver. You see here the float. On the driver's seat is Achilles Evans. He was the designer and builder of the float, assisted by Vangelis Katevatis, and the boy on the dolphin was young Apollo Katevatis, Vangelis' son, one of Vangelis' sons. In the 1980s, a lot of the original immigrants had become more affluent. Their children were educated, and the Greeks, the Hellenic community, and the Hellenic Canadian Congress of British Columbia, which was formed in 1986, started fundraising for the SFU Hellenic Chair. Mr. Nick Panos, said in his interview that they fundraised for 10 years to raise $1 million. The Hellenic studies began at SFU in 1996 with the establishment of the Hellenic Canadian Congress of British Columbia Chair in Hellenic Studies, made possible by donations from the Hellenic community of Vancouver with matching funds from the province of British Columbia. You see here from the left Nick Panos, Dr. Ted McQueenie and his wife, Apostolos Paul Physis, who was the president of the Hellenic Canadian Congress of BC at the time, and Peter Kapaduka, who was the vice president. The inaugural chairholder in 1996 was the late Andrei Gerolimatos, who worked tirelessly to secure more funding and resources to expand the discipline at SFU, and sadly we lost Dr. Andrea Gerolimatos last year. In 2005, the Greek Day returned to Broadway, thanks to the efforts of the Hellenic Canadian Congress of BC. Here you see the children of the Cretan Association dancing group waiting to dance on the main stage. Big happy day for them. A lot of them now are young men and women. And this year it'll be 15 years since the revival, the return of the Greek Day on Broadway. Here on the main stage from that year, you see some of the key organizers of Greek Day, Nick Panos, Jennis Manolakis, and to the right with the microphone, Paul Apostolos Fissas. Together with Greek Day, Hellenic Heritage Month was celebrated, and here are two events that were very successful from that first year of the Hellenic Heritage Month. One was an incredibly successful, lovely evening with Rebetika songs at the Hellenic community of Vancouver on June 24th. And the Vancouver Public Library also had a great event in Kitsilano with an exhibition of Greek books that were brought with the care of the late Apostolos Paul Fissas to Vancouver in cooperation with the Greek consulate. And the late Dr. Andrea Gerolimatos gave a lecture and led a discussion on Greek books and their history. That was a really unforgettable event. Many people were chased away by rising housing costs in the 80s and 90s, and the Greek Orthodox Church of Saints Constantine and Helen was established in the 90s in order to meet the spiritual needs of the Greek Orthodox in the area of Surrey and the Fraser Valley. The Hellenic community of Surrey and the Fraser Valley was established at the same time, and in 2010 they purchased the current building of Saints Constantine and Helen Church, and they are very, very active with food festival and other events. In 2010, of course, we had the Vancouver Olympics and Paralympics. It was a very proud moment for the community. Here we see them welcoming and hosting the Greek team at the Hellenic Community Center. From the left is Efi Karapidakis, Dimitri Zambous, the president, Peter Kletas at the time, and of course Father Dimitrios Partsafas. There were also torch relays in which the members of the Hellenic community took part. It was really, really amazing and experience for all. The city of Olympia donated to the city of Vancouver the statue of Niki, Victory, a work by Angelos Kouyoumdjis, sculptor Angelos Kouyoumdjis. However, the bronze sculpture, 4 meters long, was stored at the City Works Yard for 4 years until the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, AHEPA, and the then president, Mr. Paul Michael, was asked to organize its unveiling after finding a place for the statue. So Mr. Paul Michael, who was the leader of the AHEPA at the time, found a place at the Cordova Street Median at Thurlow, and there was a lovely unveiling ceremony. And you see here the dancing group. There were dignitaries. Mayor Gregor Robertson at the time was present, and this was the gift of Greece and especially the city of Olympia to the city of Vancouver. So if you haven't been there, go and admire this lovely sculpture. So the last few years have been years of celebrations and anniversaries. In 2017, 3 years ago, the Kids House allowed Father Konstantinos Economos, Father Partsafas, and Father Tim Pratas, Kostas Kaltsidis, and Father Dorotheo Trifonopoulos to have a joint liturgy at the Old St. George's Church on Vine and West 7th. It was a lovely evening with an unveiling of some heritage board and a commemorative plaque, and I hope it will be repeated. In November of the same year, the Hellenic community of Vancouver celebrated 90 years, and this is a commemorative book that was given to anyone who attended the gala, the dinner and gala to celebrate the 90 years of the community. Of course, an anniversary of 40 years of Greek Food Festival, which now happens in the spring and not in the fall, but always with mouth-watering food and a lot of dancing and music, and also heritage displays. As always, events like that, like the Food Festival, Greek Day, and many other fundraising events are made possible through the hard work of volunteers, and especially the ladies, the women of the Philoptochos Association that you see here, with tons of tsurekia, Easter bread, and many other delicacies they make for us all. What is really hopeful right now is that there is a new Greek school building, a new Greek school being built in the East community next to the Church of St. Nicholas and Demetrius. Of course, it's not a day school, that's a dream, but still it's great to have a new building. Because right now we don't have many immigrants from Greece. There haven't been many new immigrants. The numbers have decreased. And from 2006 to 2015, only 1,900 new permanent residents from Greece landed in Canada. So what we should do now is preserve our culture, preserve our heritage, teach the children our history, our language. There is also a lovely initiative by the Center of Hellenic Studies, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies. It's called Rebooting the Greek Language. So the center, along with Stavros Niarchos Foundation New Media Lab, has pioneered new ways to teach and learn Greek, and it's a new way to engage the young children through apps to learn about our culture and practice the Greek language. So in conclusion, and you can always go back to this Vancouver Hellenic Stories, the VPL site, for more stories and more photographs. I want to say, as I said in my presentation, that we should try to remember all the hard work of the immigrants and the people that came before us, how they started with nothing and they built all these churches and community centers. They have left such a legacy for us, and we should all be very proud and honor them and try to preserve and build on what they left for us.